Welcome back. This is the second lecture of week 2 with the title Reform and Reformation. Previous lecture, we looked at 4 of the elements that led to the crisis of the later Middle Ages: famine, plague, war, and the death brought about from all of those aspects. Essentially the 4 horses of the apocalypse in some ways, and the uprise in apocalyptic expectations, the feeling that the world is out of sync, and not only is it out of sync with what we always had assumed was the case in terms of how the world worked, all of a sudden didn't work anymore. Obviously, it wasn't all of a sudden, but with these developments I talked about last week, that began to be the sense of something is fundamentally wrong. The question is, what do we do about it? Today, we will just continue that. This crisis, late medieval crisis, the period that included far more than simply plague, famine, war, and death. And those just continued. Well, the famine didn't continue as such. And were exacerbated by other factors and developments, which we'll be looking at today. And this whole kind of period that we're looking at comprised what I've called the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Now, why is that important? Because what we see during this period is urgent calls for reformation in head and members. The traditional distinction that has been made and still is usually made, essentially what is presented in your textbook, is a distinction between late medieval reform and then Reformation, once we get to the 16th century, beginning with the church. My point is that why do we make that distinction? Why do we consider some developments to be simply reform and other developments to be Reformation? So that distinction is almost based on Reformation being identified with Luther, eventually Protestantism, and the break from adherence to the papacy in Rome. Is that then sufficient, or is that a theological understanding of Reformation as distinct from a historical understanding? That's what I want to get back to, an historical understanding of what was going on. Because if we look at the sources, and we will be talking, or I'll be talking, you'll be reading one of the primary sources from this period, the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, and you'll see there that the words used the term used was Reformation. We'll talk about other aspects in which the term Reformation was used. And then why do scholars say, well, that's not really Reformation, that is simply reform? One reason, perhaps, is because the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, as I have termed it, failed, in that it did not bring about fundamental changes in the structures of the institutional church and society. Is that really a legitimate reason then to say, well, therefore it wasn't true Reformation, it was simply reform? Or do we just simply say this endeavor, this attempt, did not realize its goals? But that attempt is really important to recognize. If we are looking at revolutions, let's say the French Revolution didn't really work. Let's say it had failed. Let's say, obviously it didn't, but okay, let's say it did. Would we still then refer to it as the French Revolution that just failed? Or would we refer to it as simply general unrest? That's a big question mark. And again, this gets back to the concept, not really a concept, is the point, my point, that the terms we use to describe events of the past affect and condition our understanding of what happened. And my attempt here is to bring us back to an understanding, or an attempt to achieve an understanding of the historical developments that led to the transformation of Europe from medieval forms, culture, and structures to what historians would refer to as early modern structures and forms. I'll be talking about that for the rest of the course in some ways. But that's what want you to think about and focus on the broader context and why we're starting with this section, part one of the course, Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, and going from there. Because if we are trying to understand, even if you want to say, okay, what I really am interested in is the developments of the 16th century, if that were the case, then how can we really understand what's new and different if we don't have an understanding of what had come before? That's the point here. So I make a big distinction between the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and then Luther's Reformation, and then the developments therefrom going into what I will be talking about confessionalization. In some ways, that's the big distinction. The Reformation of the later Middle Ages, will be argued, was based on what I've termed religionization, whereas the Reformation in the 16th century became based on what other scholars have referred to as confessionalization. But we'll be dealing with those concepts later on. That's just the broader picture to bring us back to where we are today. This lecture on Reform and Reformation. We'll look at some of the developments that were going on in a general sense at the same time as those major developments or events of crises that I talked about last week. And so don't think, please, that last week I dealt with the crisis and this is something different. It's all part of a general late medieval crisis. Also, make sure we get the chronology, because where I'll be starting here actually precedes the onset of the famine. So that's not necessarily the beginning of it all, but they're all essentially kind of going together, these different aspects and factions, to bring about, in general, this crisis, this attempt at reformation, provides a necessary background to understand what happened when we go into the 16th century, when changes certainly did come about. So that being the kind of the preface to all this. And you've looked at the syllabus, you know that after this lecture, your first midterm is due. And I'll be talking about that first midterm at the end of this lecture. So that all in mind, we start going with, get going on this lecture after the introduction. First slide, the Afghanese papacy. And this brings us to part of this crisis, because politically, talk about the famine, the plague, and politically, as the plague was going on, as the famine was just being recovered from, there was a crisis within the political context of the relationship between the Pope and the Emperor, between the Pope and other kings, between the ecclesiastical power and the lay power. Again, I've said, I think, already, but I'll stress it again because I think it's very important to understand what was going on at the time. This is not a struggle between, quote-unquote, church and state. It's a struggle over who had ultimate authority. Did the clergy, culminating in the Pope, or did the laity, culminating in the Emperor? This was a crisis that even was shocking at the time. And I'll talk about some of those things when we get there. But let's look at the background first and talk about this Afghanese papacy. Now, I hope, as you all know, the seat of the papacy was Rome. Rome was supposedly the diocese of St. Peter. And so the Bishop of Rome was Peter's successor. And this gets back to the whole issue of the development of the papacy in the earlier Middle Ages. And I'm not going to go back into all of those developments. But the papacy had become, already in the 13th century, what scholars refer to as the papal monarchy. Attempts to claim that the Pope was simply another monarch. I believe in the last lecture, I talked about the bishops and the prince bishops. And the Pope was a little bit different, but yet still, the Pope ruled over central Italy. And that goes back to all the way back to the 8th century and what was called the Franco-Papal Alliance that created the Papal States. So that the Pope was both the Bishop of Rome and the territorial leader of central Italy, combining the spiritual and the temporal. And that caused conflicts. Moreover, the Pope, as Pope, claimed to be the ultimate authority over all of Christendom. This would come in conflict. What was the relationship? Now, this conflict between Pope and Emperor, between the temporal power and the spiritual power, between the secular rulers and the ecclesiastical rulers, goes all the way back to the early Middle Ages, even late antiquity. Pope Gelasius talks about the two powers, or the two lights, the sun and the moon. The Pope speaking into the moon is the temporal power, and that has the job of reflecting the light from the sun, which is the ecclesiastical power. Obviously, emperors didn't really see it that way. Other princes didn't see it that way either, and really saw it as an issue of the clergy functions as part of the state. And we are the ones who are actually in charge. Now, we'll see some of those conflicts break out in the early 14th century as never before. Now, they've been there before. But the conflict becomes far greater and the divisions become far more serious beginning in the early 14th century. So let's look at some of the origins. When we look at the later 13th century, we have issues going on. We have problems with the election of Pope, namely Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII, and you can't go into all the details. And this is such, for me, this is such an exciting period in development. So I'm going to try to not allow myself to get carried away by the details, which are really necessary in my view to understand it all, but just kind of to hit the peaks, so to speak, along the way. But Boniface VIII was usually been seen as one of the more infamous popes of the Middle Ages for reasons we'll get to. He was a crusty old man, very ambitious. He was from the Gaetani family. And this goes back to the death of Pope Nicholas IV in 1292. Because in 1292, when the Pope dies, there has to be a new election, right? So the cardinals got together, and they could not decide on whom to elect as the new Pope. So what do they do about it? Well, they go back and forth and back and forth. This is all political because the cardinals were often, most of them were, from powerful Italian families, and they're all politically trying to position themselves so that someone from their family, one of their cardinals, could become Pope. Now, you don't have to be a cardinal to be elected Pope, but the cardinals do elect the Pope. And because of this political tension, both on the familial political level as well as on simply the problems of agreeing on a candidate, there was a papal vacancy for quite a while, about a year and a half or so. And finally, they decided upon a compromise. There was a well-known spiritual man, a hermit, a Franciscan hermit, living up in the hills of Tuscany, named Peter Morone. And they said, why don't we then elect Peter? He's not going to be around for long. And then we can really kind of deal with this situation. Now, footnote, we will see again how compromise never really works out in terms, at least, of electing the Pope. The story is that when they went to find Peter Morone, brother Peter Morone, Franciscan, up in his cave and probably in the Tuscan hills, to tell him he had been elected Pope, he wept. He did not want to be Pope. He, he was a spiritual man, a hermit. And if there ever was a Pope who was genuinely a spiritual man, is Peter Morone. He took the name Celestine V. And he was well named. Celestine means heavenly, and that's certainly what he was. But he reluctantly goes to Rome and becomes Pope, but he isn't really Pope. Everyone knows that. And after a few months in office, he resigns. Now, one of the cardinals, Benedict Gaetani, had presented the case for Celestine's resignation to the College of Cardinals. Benedict was a very competent canon lawyer, well respected as a canon lawyer, He was also very ambitious, also for his family. He was from one of the newer families, newer in that they rose to power and wealth only in the 13th century rather than all the way back in the 12th or 11th century. So he was kind of seen as one of the newcomers. Had opponents already within the College of Cardinals. He certainly wanted to be Pope, but he couldn't pull it off politically in 1294 when they finally decided on Peter Moroni. But he started to kind of work with Peter Moroni, and that caused opposition. Now, Boniface, he became Boniface. Benedict Gaetani had enemies, and the enemies started, once Benedict became Pope, which I'll get back to in a second, started accusing him of all kinds of things. Everything from sodomy to, simony and everything else. What we know about Benedict Gaetani and Pope Boniface VIII, again I'll get to in a second, was that a lot of those charges may have been true. We can't say for sure. But when we put it in the context of these are the people who are adamantly against him, and they're going to be throwing anything at him to see what sticks, so to speak, using kind of our terminology, we can't say that just because he was accused of these things, he actually was that way. But one of the things he was accused of, literally, was going to Celestian's bedroom by night and calling out to Celestian. 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 This is the Lord. Oh, Lord. Celestian was a spiritual man. You don't want to be Pope, do you, Celestian? No, Lord, I don't. Then resign, Celestian. What? I can do that? Yes, Celestian, you can resign. Okay. So he resigns. Make a very complex story short. There had to be a new election, December 12th, 94. And this time, Benedict Gaetani was able to pull it off. He was elected Pope, became Pope Boniface VIII. But his enemies were pretty upset with this. In terms of those charges, did Boniface really go to the bedroom window of Celestian and say those things? We don't know. We do have it in the documents that that's what he was accused of. He certainly very well may have. But the point was, he did present the case for abdication. It's a big thing. Popes don't, quit. That was one of the issues. Popes don't quit. So Boniface was already a controversial figure when he was elected in 1200. And other cardinals and their families started scheming against him. How can we get rid of him? One of the big arguments was his election was not valid, precisely because a pope can't resign. One of the Augustine hermits, Giles of Rome, people I study a lot, wrote a treatise on the renunciation of the papacy, the Renunciazione Papae, giving the theological and legal arguments to support Boniface's election as having been valid. That yes, you can indeed abdicate the papacy, but that gets into all kinds of complexities that are fascinating, but I can't really bring them in here. I'm already kind of going further into the forest than I had planned to. So we have Boniface as this controversial figure, and at the same time, there's also problems then with France. The King of France is Philip IV. Philip IV had been fighting England. I mentioned the 100 Years' War in the last lecture. But England and France had been fighting long before the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. And France, Philip IV had a problem because it's like he needed more money to fund his campaigns against England. He felt that he had already taxed his nobles about as much as he possibly could. So he said, where do I get more revenue? He said, the church is not taxed. Church lands are not taxed. And the church, i.e. bishops, abbots, archbishops, was the largest landholder in France. He said, I'm going to tax the clergy. So he does. And Boniface, as Pope now, says, you can't do that. And so there is conflict going back and forth, treatises written back and forth, letters written back and forth. They finally come to a compromise whereby Philip says, okay, I can't do it, but with your permission, I can. Boniface says, yes, with your permission, I can. So in this case, I'll give you permission. This is a one-off. Don't do it anymore. That led to not only Philip IV, but also his advisors feeling that Boniface was trying to interfere within the internal affairs of France. That was not allowed. How dare the Pope, a spiritual power, try to determine what was the policy going to be of the temporal power, the lay power, in this case, the King of France, who, again, traced their origins back to Charlemagne and therefore considered himself as, an emperor within his own territory. Theoretically, he was underneath the emperor, but practically, he was in charge. So Philip IV and his advisors teamed up with some of the cardinals who were against Boniface, thinking of how to get rid of him. They didn't know, weren't sure what to do. Things came to a head in 1302, and Boniface said, I got to really figure out what to do about this. So he sat down, he called a council. Didn't last very long. They condemned some of the actions of Philip IV's advisors, but did not condemn Philip as such. And they left, and Boniface said, more needs to be done. And he sat down and wrote what, in some ways, has become the most infamous bull of the late Middle Ages, a papal bull, with the title Unam Sanctam, which just simply comes from the creed, I believe, in one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Latin, Unam Sanctam, one Holy, Unam Sanctam Ecclesia. Anyway, he did so with the help, so to speak, of Giles of Rome, an Augustinian hermit who had been the prior general of the order. Giles had written a treatise for Boniface on ecclesiastical power, and Boniface used some of that word for word, cutting and pasting, without citing, but I guess it'd be another issue, for his bull condemning Philip and asserting that every Christian must be directly subject to the Pope for salvation. Now that was a pretty strong statement. Giles' treatise on ecclesiastical power has been seen as one of the most extreme treatises on the what's called papal hierocratic theory, on the theory of the Pope being above the emperor and all temporal rulers that have been written to that time. Theoretically, though, going back to the 11th century, Gregory VII had not issued, but had written a document called the Dictatus Papae in 1075, which he made a series of claims about the power of the papacy. And in those claims, Boniface certainly didn't go any further than had Gregory. The difference is that Gregory had written this document, and scholars still debate really what it was for, not as an official position of the papacy, but almost as a wish list or as a guide to what he was hoping to achieve in his conflicts with Emperor Henry IV back in the day in the later 11th century. Now, Philip viewed Unam Sanctam as appalling. He said, how dare he? What are we going to do with this? The Pope has run amok. What we need to do is try him for heresy because Unam Sanctam is an heretical document. So Philip IV sent an armed contingent to invade Italy, cross the Alps, go south, and find Boniface, capture him. That was their task, capture him, and bring him back to Paris to be tried for heresy. Well, Boniface happened to be in his family's home in Anagni. If you look at the PowerPoint slide, this is the debacle at Anagni. And they went into this village. Anagni was outside of Rome. And they found Boniface in his bedroom, as the sources say and talk about it. Supposedly Boniface, when he saw the soldiers come into his bedroom, he got out of bed, got down on his knees, opened up his nightshirt and said, here it is, whack it off. They didn't know what to do. Of course, they were led by the highest advisors of the king, but he didn't really think he had the authority just to behead the Pope there and then, but they were deciding what to do. And as they were trying to figure out what to do with this cantankerous old Pope, the citizens, inhabitants of the village, Anagni, came to their defense and started to repel the French troops, whereby Peter Float, who was there, the advisor, so we have to go help them. So they left Boniface there, and they actually the citizens of Anagni were successful in expelling the French. They went back to Paris without having achieved their goal. What they had done was essentially mug the Pope. This is called the debacle of Anagni. It was a shock. And even Dante, the poet Dante, who hated Boniface's guts, in his Divine Comedy, placed Boniface in like the 6th or 7th circle of hell. But he was shocked by it. You don't treat a pope that way, even if you hate his guts, even if he's a terrible pope. You don't go and mug the Pope. Well, what did Boniface do? Boniface went out and absolved all the citizens from any sins they may have committed in coming to his defense, went back to Rome, and died. Now, what do we do? It's a dilemma. It's a problem. Because a pope has to be elected. Boniface dies in 1303. I believe the next pope was elected was like Benedict the 11th or something like that. I forget exactly the name, but it didn't last very long. And the next pope that was elected that didn't stay was Clement V. I forget his name before he became Clement. But as the name that he took, Clement, may indicate, he was French. And this has been a period that then scholars have referred to the papacy as simply having been in the back pocket of the King of France. Not quite the case. But the influence of the French within the papacy becomes very marked. That's without question. Clement was like, okay, what do we do? It's 1305, he's elected. Rome is in turmoil. So in 1309, Clement says, I can't rule in Rome. The political conflict is too great. I can't be an effective ruler of the universal church from here, so I'm going to move. I'm going to go and, here's a great little place, Avignon, which is north of the Alps. Technically, it's not part of the Kingdom of France, but yet de facto, it's definitely a French city. And I'm going to kind of set up shop there. Now, popes moving around previously certainly happened at times. And it was not that big of a deal as such when it first happened. But the thing is, once Clement moved there, the papacy stayed in Avignon, and that then gave the term, or led to the term, the Avignonese papacy, the Pope being in Avignon, residing in Avignon. Clement was the one that first moved there, but then his successor, John the 22nd, was the one who actually established the papacy there. John the 22nd, I'll get back to his election in a second, moved the entire papal administration from Rome to Avignon. He started building the papal palace in Avignon, which is still there today, and really entrenched the papacy in Avignon. So just think about it a minute. The Pope in Avignon, fine. Emperors could move around even though they have their capitals. Kings could move around even though they have their capitals. And they were still king. And as the head of the Universal Church, that was not a problem. But the Pope was also the Bishop of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome was the head of the Diocese of Rome. And there had been an abuse that had been condemned back in the 11th century with Gregory VII, called condemning non-resident bishops who were installed as bishops but did not live and work in their diocese. They didn't function as bishops. It's called non-resident bishops. And so all of a sudden now the Pope is a non-resident bishop, even though he's still the head of the church. It's a very complex debate and the arguments are a very fine distinction to make because it all is all based on what do we mean by the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome and the successor of Peter, but the Pope is also the head of the church overall. The Pope is also an individual. And those three aspects, the Pope is the head of the universal church, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, and the Pope as an individual, could come into conflict. Those distinctions weren't always made by any means, but we have to be aware that that was what was going on. So the problem was, as an individual, as I will get to in a second, could there be bad popes? Of course there could be bad popes. Individuals are individual human beings, and they're fallible and everything else. Pope as the head of the universal church was a big deal, but the Pope as the Bishop of Rome was also a big deal. And what's the relationship between those two? We'll get into that in a second. Now, what happens in Avignon with Clement V? He made it kind of a deal with the King of Naples, Robert of Anjou. And I won't go into all the details here either. Robert and his family had somewhat recently, going back to the later 13th century with his Sicilian Vespers, become king of Naples and Sicily. He was Angevin. The Duchy of Anjou was actually a duchy within France, but he had become king of Naples. He was also the papal vicar in Italy, which meant that he supposedly was the military arm of the papacy to defend the papacy in the temporal realm. Because theoretically, the Pope is not a noble who fights. Nobles fight. Pope is not theoretically a noble, going back to those three orders. Therefore, is not supposed to fight. Did popes fight? Well, sometimes. Did they support armies all the time? So there's a real issue there in conflict between these distinctions that theoretically should have been there, but then practically weren't. So anyway, but the fact that Robert was kind of allied with the papacy. In Italy, we get all kinds of different factions, political factions. There's those who are supporters of the emperor, the Guelph, the Ghibellini, and then the Guelph are the supporters of the Pope. All kinds of conflicts going on here. And Robert and Clement got together and they said, okay, we need to do something because, there's a real problem with the papacy, and that is the emperor. It's not so much the king of France, he has a problem, but if we can take care of the problem between the Pope and the emperor, that will help with taking care of the problems with the Pope and the King of France or any other kings, because theoretically they're the same. So Robert and Clement said, what we're going to do is plan A. We're going to get rid of the emperor. We're just going to do away with the office of emperor. So, and how we're going to do that? Well, when the emperor dies, current emperor was Henry VII. When the emperor dies, we are going to prevent an imperial election. So we're just going to make it so that a new emperor cannot be elected. Therefore, there'll be no emperor. Yeah. Plan B was, if that somehow couldn't come about, we are going to make sure that the emperor, whoever might be elected, has to come to you, Clement, to be crowned as emperor for legitimacy, thereby placing the emperor clearly under your authority and power, where you would therefore be clearly superior to the emperor. Sounds like a good plan. So, get that going in effect. Now, the Emperor Henry VII didn't know this was going on at the time, but he was very eager to reassert imperial control over northern Italy and Italian lands as such. And he said, there's an issue here. It's Robert, who's part of the papal faction, has not done homage for his duchy in Anjou. So Henry VII, the Emperor Henry VII, told Robert, you have to come to court, do homage for your duchy. Robert says, what? You gotta be kidding me. No, I'm king. I don't need to do that. I'm king of Naples. And he says, fine, you're king of Naples, but you're also Duke of Anjou, and that is under my authority. Unless you come to me and perform homage, meaning I become my man, you are a rebellious vassal. What does a rebellious vassal means? It's counter to feudal law. That means your lands are forfeited. You're not really a vassal. And Henry then said, okay, I'll offer big rewards for anyone who can bring me Robert's head, unless I get there first. And Henry invades. He invades Italy. He's doing pretty well. And Robert's kind of like, except all of a sudden, it's getting kind of close. And Henry's forces get just near Rome. This is in 1314. Robert's getting very nervous, and Henry dies. Miracle, divine intervention. Well, maybe. Henry and his forces were camped in a malaria bed, so he died of malaria and didn't get to Robert. So all of a sudden, though, the emperor is dead. Great. Plan A of Clement and Robert can be put into effect. We're going to prevent another election. But what happened? Clement died. So all of a sudden, we have an imperial vacancy and we have a papal vacancy. Plan A didn't work. Plan B, what do? We don't even have a pope now. And that led to a split election. And this is all kind of the background to the point up there on this same slide, Louis of Bavaria and John the 22nd, because the electors, the German electors got together and they elected Frederick of Austria. Frederick of Austria was an old man, right? But some of the electors said, we didn't want Frederick. We were coerced to vote for Frederick. We're going to reconvene and elect the true emperor. So they reconvened and then elected Louis, Duke of Bavaria. There was a split election. Louis of Bavaria, what do you do about it? What do you do with this split election? Both had some authority. Frederick was like, okay, it's fine. I'm happy. I'm from Austria. Give me the title and you can do whatever you want, Louis. I don't care all that much. I mean, they did come to Louis eventually defeated him militarily in 1330, or that gets there a bit later. But Louis started fashioning himself as emperor. There still was no pope. But Louis starts assuming the role of emperor for all of the empire, while the cardinals can't really elect anybody. Only finally in 1316, they get together, and with the influence of Robert of Anjou, who suggests that they elect the Archbishop of Avignon, forbid his chaplain. They do so as a compromise, because again, that chaplain, who had been Robert's chaplain, became Archbishop of Avignon, was a man by the name of Jacques de Cahors. He was old. He was an old man already. Robert suggested him as a compromise candidate, and the cardinals, once again, not having learned their lesson, elected Jacques de Cahors as pope, and Jacques de Cahors took the name John the 22nd. John the 22nd was to become one of the most, Boniface was bad, almost even more infamous than Boniface, even though he's not quite as well known. John the 22nd was the one who then established the papacy in Avignon, moved all the papacy in Avignon, was trying to put the church in order, and he did a couple of things. He excommunicated the North Italian cities because they were part of this opposition party supporting the emperor. And that got them upset. That got Louis of Bavaria upset. And another thing he did was looking at the religious life, the Franciscans. This is in 1323. He issues a bull, John the 22nd issues a bull, cum inter non nullos, when among others, in which he condemned the Franciscan ideal of poverty. The Franciscan order had been approved by Innocent III back in 1209 or so, had been supported by popes all the way through, and claimed to be the most perfect representatives of Christ, to live the life that was closest to the true imitation of Christ. That was their ideal: to own no property, to follow the naked Christ, poor naked Christ, as they go. John realized there was a problem here, because if the Franciscans represented the highest form of Christian perfection, what was John to do? He was Pope. That means any Franciscan was more perfect than John. John said, I condemn the statement that Christ and the apostles owned no property, which was basically the foundation of the Franciscan ideal. That is heretical to say. Why? Because Christ is Lord over all. If he owned no property, he was a thief. What did he do? He goes into the cornfield and takes corn on the Sabbath. Going into Jerusalem, he tells a couple of his disciples, go into town, you'll see a donkey tied up, take the donkey, and if the owner says, what are you doing? Tell him the Lord needs it. Either he stole that donkey or that donkey was already his. The Pope is the highest authority and has dominium or lordship over all. So to say that Christ did not have lordship or ownership, dominion, is a heretical statement. He's God after all. This was a huge conflict. There had been issues in terms of poverty movements earlier on, not just with the Franciscans, but heretical movements or movements that were deemed heretical because they were very critical of the institutional church, going back to the 12th century. So it was an ongoing tension and problem, especially as the papacy grew in wealth and in power. This critique how they handle it. That's where the mendicants came in to offer a way out for the Pope, because the Pope was supporting these mendicants who were supposed to be poor, even though the Franciscans were the only ones who were absolutely poor in that sense, but individually they were all poor. And to say, okay, there's different sides of the coin, and this side represents that poor naked Christ as he was preaching on earth, whereas the papacy is the vicar of Christ, as Christ has ascended into heaven and is the ruler of everything. Now, John says, okay, we have to condemn this concept, which seems to be a problem. Has all kinds of problems. Well, Louis of Bavaria was thinking that John was just going too far. Moreover, John tried to put Plan B into effect, the plan that between Clement and Robert of Anjou, to say, Louis, you're not emperor. You're not emperor until I crown you as emperor. So you need to come to me to be crowned as emperor. Louis said, to you, you work for me. I'm the emperor. So John excommunicates him. There's tensions, and to make a very long story short again, it's been estimated that John spent 2/3 of his income on armies to fight Louis. This is armed conflict. Now, not only was it armed conflict, it also was ideological conflict, philosophical conflict, and both John and Louis had their theorists arguing for their position. And the theorist, the scholar who was supporting Louis, was a man by the name of Marsilius of Padua. Marsilius of Padua was a scholar of Paris, and in 1324 he wrote what was the most radical treatise of political philosophy in the Middle Ages, the Defensor of the Peace, Defensor Pacis. And it's a very complex work. It's a fantastic work. Kind of difficult, but essentially he argued that the papacy should be abolished because peace is a goal for Christendom, and we don't have peace. And why don't we have peace? Because the Pope keeps sticking his nose into temporal affairs. Essentially, the emperor, or what Marsilius referred to as the legislator, who did not have to be an emperor, but Marsilius does dedicate the work to Louis and refers to Louis as the legislator of the state, is the head of the church, so the head of Christendom. And the Pope and the clergy has a essential function, especially in a Christian state, just as the garbage collectors, just as the artisans and the bakers and everything else. The state can't function without the clergy, at least not function the way it's supposed to be as a Christian state. But the hierarchy is a human institution. So if the hierarchy from Pope to archbishops to bishops to priests was a human institution, humans can get rid of it. The priesthood is what was established by God, but God did not establish the whole hierarchy, according to Marsilius, and so therefore we should abolish the papacy. And this is an extensive work, and fantastic work. I always thought it was great. And Marsilius was no armchair theorist. He was with Louis when Louis invaded Rome, in 1328 and proclaimed John the 22nd. John the 22nd, keep in mind, was in Avignon, but proclaims John the 22nd deposed and establishes anti-pope, or his own pope, Nicholas V. There was some conflict there. Some people started following Nicholas, others did not. Most people did not. But then Louis proved to be a rather harsh taskmaster, even though he had the support of the North Italian cities. When he first invades, he also had set up camp up there in the north for a while before going down to Rome. And they all of a sudden felt that he's no better than the Pope. So what did the North Italian cities do? They made up with the Pope, and eventually they expelled Louis. And in 1330, Louis went back north of the Alps, went back to Munich, and never returned to Italy thereafter. He did, though, finally settle things in empire, defeated Frederick of Austria, so he was the sole emperor for a while. But this conflict was huge, and especially the Franciscans were adamantly opposed to John the 22nd, and they started writing against him. They started referring to him as the Antichrist, and it was horrible. Yeah. These Franciscans who sided with Louis against the Pope, someone, an anonymous Franciscan, helped Louis in 1324, also before he invaded, with a document Louis produced known as the Sachsenhausen Appeal. It's called Sachsenhausen because it was simply in the town of Sachsenhausen, where it was issued. This is an imperial decree. And what is it? It was Louis of Bavaria's calling for a church council of German clergy to get rid of Boniface. No, excuse me, not Boniface, John the 22nd. There is a section of that imperial decree that scholars have referred to as the Franciscan insert. I accept that, but it wasn't a section of the text was written not by Boniface or his advisors, but by an anonymous Franciscan. But the point being is, at the time, this was all part of the imperial decree or document of the Sachsenhausen Appeal, calling for the deposition of John. In this Franciscan insert, so to speak, the argument goes as follows. John the 22nd has condemned the statement that Christ and the apostles own no property, which is the basis for the Franciscan way of life, as the highest form of Christian perfection. Pope Nicholas III, already in 1231, had proclaimed the Franciscan way of life as the highest form of Christian perfection. We've already had papal authority for that. Since, in matters of faith and morals, the Pope is infallible, John the 22nd has condemned an infallible decree. Only the Antichrist can do that. Therefore, John the 22nd is the Antichrist. Now, this is the first argument in existence that we know of proclaiming papal infallibility. The concept was not there. So what was John's response? John's response was, what a bunch of bull. This is ridiculous. I'm not infallible. A human being, after all. I'm supreme. Papal supremacy trumps papal infallibility. Because what does papal infallibility do? It limits me to the bozo decisions of my predecessors. Can I overturn what a previous pope said and did? Of course I can. I'm supreme. Now, he may have said it was all BS, but it still was issued in the imperial decree, came out the same year as Marcellus Padua, his Defensor of the Peace. John was kind of hit with a double-barrel shotgun. But he had his own support, and he turned to the Augustinian hermit, Augustinus of Ancona. Augustinus of Ancona was actually working in Naples. He was the new chaplain for Robert of Anjou. And as I already mentioned, Giles of Rome, the Augustinian hermit, had written for Boniface. Augustinus writes for John the 22nd. And in 1326 comes out with his comprehensive treatment of ecclesiastical or papal authority. This is an amazing work. It's an amazing work. It's never been edited. Only a very few snippets have ever been translated. It goes far beyond even Giles. And he's really pushing to see how far you can go. It's a very scholastic work. It's a Summa, after all, which goes back to the 13th century Summa. So he's trying to investigate all aspects. He, too, then deals with the question, is the Pope infallible? Now, he has to do that because in the Sachsenhausen appeal has been put forward in the first time. What does Augustinus argue? Augustinus argues, is the Pope infallible? Yes, the Pope is infallible as long as he does not err. So we have a fallible, infallible Pope. That was kind of thinking that Augustinus put forward. He also did things like saying, what can the Pope empty purgatory? And Augustinus says, yes, the Pope has all the power of Christ. The Pope is Christ's vicar on earth. And since Christ has given the Pope all of his power, the Pope can empty purgatory. But he would err if he did so, because the Pope does not have all of Christ's knowledge. There's those two keys. Key of power, key of knowledge. As well as the two keys of the kingdom, all those other things. The keys gets to be complex because they can refer to different things. But here's the key of knowledge and the key of power. And Pope has all of Christ's power, but he doesn't have all of Christ's knowledge. And so if he acted without knowledge and emptied purgatory, he would err. He would have to basically go to hell. Because, though, you know what? God judges the Pope. No one else can. That's what Augustinus also says. Do we have to obey it, or can there be bad popes? Yes, there can be bad popes. There certainly have been bad popes, and we certainly may have future bad popes. Do we have to obey them? Oh, yes. Unless they dictate that you are to be heretical. Meaning, if the Pope were to say, I want every Christian, and they must do this according to, for their salvation, must worship Satan. You don't follow that decree. But something so stupid as, and maybe even referred to this part, I think I've referred to this a little bit already. Pope said everyone has to wear pink. That's a stupid, ridiculous decree, but you would have to do so. Can you call it stupid and ridiculous? Yes, but you have to obey. Who judges the Pope? God judges the Pope. So many ways, Augustinus, even though he pushes as far as you possibly can the limits of papal power, also is letting John the 22nd know the limits thereof, and therefore it's a warning to John. Just like he says, does the Pope have to live in Rome? He says, no, the Pope is the head of the universal church. The Pope can live anywhere. And he says, but the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome. And as the Bishop of Rome, the Pope must live in Rome. Going back to the non-residency issue. The Pope must live in Rome. So it's this yes-no issue depending on how you're looking at it. John was living in Avignon. Those are some of the tensions and the distinctions that are made and the complexity of the issues. But John the 22nd loved it. I mean, it's kind of questionable how closely he read it. He just sees, Pope has all the power of Christ. It's like, yay! So what happens? Well, I said Lewis invades and he's pushed back, and John kind of continues. He ends up dying only a number of years later. But this conflict just continued, and the papacy remained at Avignon for a long time. And that brings me then to the Babylonian captivity of the church, which was the term that the Italian humanist Petrarch gave it. This is the Babylonian captivity. The papacy is being held captive in France, even though technically it was not France. Just as the Israelites were held slavery in Babylon. There was a lot of animosity. What's going on? Something is really bad. What do we do about it? Things were just about to get even worse. Which brings next slide, finally, the Great Western Schism. 1378 to 1450. Gregory XI was Pope, and he was determined to return to Rome. He finally does so in 1377, and then he dies. What has to happen? There has to be a new papal election. So, guess what? They can't really decide who's going to be Pope. Surprising. They elect someone, took the name, I forget again, the original name, took the name Urban V. The people of Rome were clamoring for an Italian, or actually for a Roman. They were demonstrating outside St. Peter's, saying, give us a Roman Pope. We have to have a Roman Pope. We're tired of all these French popes. We have to have a Roman Pope. If not a Roman, at least an Italian. And the cardinals capitulated and did so and elected Urban. Problem is, another thing that John XXII had done was to increase the College of Cardinals and fill those new positions primarily with French clergy. So there's a very strong French presence within the College of Cardinals. Those French cardinals said, you know what, we were compelled to vote for Urban. We didn't really want to vote for Urban. It was under compulsion. And an election that is conducted under compulsion is not a valid election. So we are going to go back to Avignon and elect the Pope. So they did. They elected Clement VI. What a pain. Clement VI, it was Clement VII. Sorry, I think it was Clement VII. I apologize. Clement VII. We have Clement and Urban. We have a Viennese Pope and the Roman Pope. Now, there had been split elections before. There had been anti-popes, quote-unquote anti-popes before. Mentioned this Bavaria set up Nicholas V. He had some support, but kind of fell apart. What made this split election so serious was that the territories in Europe, the political powers in Europe, also split. Evenly enough that both popes had claims to legitimacy. What do you do? If you're Urban, you believe, let's say even taking the most generous interpretation, if you're Urban, you believe that you're Pope. What do you do with this bozo back in Avignon who is claiming to be Pope? That's a schismatic. That's even worse than being a heretic. You excommunicate Urban or Clement. Now, if you're Clement, you believe that you were Pope. The guy in Rome is a schismatic. So what do? You excommunicate Urban. Funny things about excommunication. When a leader is excommunicated, whether it's the emperor or princes or popes, everyone following them is also under the ban. All of Europe was under the ban from one pope or the other. Now, if you were a follower of Urban, you didn't really care that Clement had excommunicated Urban, and therefore you were under the ban. And why is this an issue? And vice versa, of course. Because, though, the question was, how do we really know? And we know from Paul, in terms of the Mass, receiving communion, he who eats unworthily is worthy of death. So if I take communion when I'm not supposed to take communion, am I eating to my damnation? How do I know? My priest says, no, we're following Urban, or we're following Clement. That could well be, but maybe they're wrong. The sense of anxiety, of uncertainty, became widespread because all of a sudden, the leader of Christendom, even if it's in conflict and tension with the emperor, is now split. The seamless robe of Christ has been split. The institutional church has become a monster with two heads. What do we do? How do we deal with this? How do we handle it? That was the problem and the issue. Now, this brings us to Ciliarism. I think what I'm going to do now is take a little break, come back and do a part 2, lecture 2, part 2, which I'll try to finish it. So I'll leave it in the sense of this great schism with these two popes, with all of Europe being under excommunication from one pope or the other, rising tensions and anxiety. And keep in mind, the plague was going on through this time. Yes, it subsided in 1350, but we're only 20 years or 27, 30 years on. 100 Years' War is still going on. You have John the 22nd having fought with Louis of Bavaria with troops. What do we do? What the hell is going on? And what do we do about it? One answer was conciliarism. Now I will, again, stop there and begin with conciliarism after this break. I will be back shortly to continue week 2, lecture 2. Thank you very much.